as I'm getting started, I want to ask you, does this world make sense to you?
Of course.
Of course. Yeah. Well, come on up. Give the talk, my friend. Because I feel like the more I try to make sense of this world, the more stress I get, the more misery I get, the more trouble I have inside of myself, right? The ways that I set up certain belief systems around this world, like when a painful experience happens and something that my mind says is bad, and is this a punishment? Am I being punished for this, something I did wrong? And am I putting like this whole, is the world a bad place? And I'm trying to make sense of this world. Or something pleasant happens, and where I'm like, well, is the world an all good place? And so is the world all good? Is the world all bad? Am I all good? Am I all bad? Or are people all good and all bad? It's quite a stressful rumination I find myself in. And then even like all the other stories I tell myself of like, do I belong here? Do I belong here in this seat? Do I belong here with these people? Do I belong here in this world, right? And all the ways I try to figure out what reality is all about, right? And luckily, we have what the Buddha called the all. In a certain discourse, the Buddha discussed the all. And what this is describing is an answer to all of these questions, believe it or not. And it gets into what we call the Dharma, the truth of all things. And, there's kind of like a rolling of my eyes, like, yeah, right, this old dead guy described all reality. It's not that complex. Really, it's something you probably learned in kindergarten. And so in this discourse, the Sabha Sutta, what we call the discourse on the all, the Blessed One, the Buddha said, what is the all? Simply, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. That's the all. And what else is there? Nothing. That is all of reality. You do not experience anything besides these 6 things: the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the felt body, and the mind. You only see, hear, taste, touch, and so on. That's it. That's all of reality. And the reason I ended up on this topic is I'm covering for Maddie tonight, and on these Wednesdays we've been going over what is called the Satipatthana Sutta. The Satipatthana Sutta is the traditional discourse on mindfulness, the 4 foundations of mindfulness. Mindfulness of breath and body, and I'm sure y'all have gone over that a bunch. Mindfulness of feelings, the felt sensations of pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. Mindfulness of the mind, the way we observe our thoughts. We have this, like what they call in the psychology world, metacognition, where we know a thought is a thought. And we find ourselves in the 4th foundation, mindfulness of dhammas, or mindfulness of dharmas. And what this 4th foundation is a category of a bunch of lists that explain what the Dharma is. And what is the Dharma? This word Dharma has a bunch of different meanings, but ultimately it means truth. And I like to say, Buddhism doesn't have a monopoly on the truth by any means. And even in the time of the Buddha, you would hear different dharmas, right? There'd be the Jain's dharma, or this teacher's dharma, or this philosopher's dharma. What we do here is the Buddha's dharma, the way the Buddha described reality, the way the Buddha described truth. And so, how do we make sense of the world? How do we find this truth? We come back to our senses. To make sense of the world, you come back to your senses, because that's all what reality is. Because how many times I fall into the delusions of my limiting beliefs, my stressful ruminations. And really in mindfulness, it's a way to remember to come back to your senses. This word sati, S-A-T-I, and satipatthana, sati, is an old word that British scholars translated to the word mindfulness. Okay, mindfulness is a great word for sati, but in a traditional, very direct way of defining this word sati, it means to remember. To remember. So when you're lost in judgment, plans, fantasy, you remember to come back to the breath, right? And so in this practice, we remember to come back to our senses when we are trying to make sense of the world. And when we come back to our senses, yeah, it has a bit of a stress relief, right? Even if there's unpleasant sights or unpleasant sensations in the body, we can make peace with those unpleasant sights and sensations when we have that direct touching of that intimacy. But also, not only does it work as a tool to use in our stress reduction, and use it as a tool of your stress reduction. When you find yourself bugging out, notice what sense is bugging out right now. And it also leads to great liberation. The ending of suffering. You know, mindfulness-based stress reduction is great, but here we're for like stress elimination. We're here for the ending of suffering, because that's what the Buddha taught. Suffering at its end. And so, let's step into how these senses can be an ending of our suffering in this very moment. There's a wonderful story that talks about how somebody reached awakening through mindfulness of these 6 senses. And I didn't say this earlier. We have 6 senses in Buddhism. It's not like woo reading mind 6th sense, but it's the 5 you learn in kindergarten plus the mind. The mind is just another sense. The mind thinks just like the eyes see, just like the ears hear, just like the body feels. The mind thinks. It's just another sense organ. So, how this leads to awakening and how practicing these 6 senses can end your suffering. The story of Baha'ya of the bark cloth. Any of y'all hear of Baha'ya of the bark cloth? I found that this is like an underrated story in early Buddhism. Baha'ya of the bark cloth was well known as this meditation master, well known as somebody that has reached awakening and enlightenment. And he comes from a very strict ascetic tradition. And in this tradition, he didn't come from the Buddhist tradition, he came from another tradition that they wouldn't wear clothes because they thought clothes were sinful or something like that. So he wore bark. And he had bark clothes, so that's why they call him Baha'ya of the bark cloth, because he's the wacky guy that's running around all awakened and shit wearing bark, right? Wild sight to see. So, one day, Baha'ya came in contact with some Buddhist monks. And these Buddhist monks, he noticed, were a little bit different than he expected. These Buddhist monks had something that he didn't have. And he started questioning himself. He's like, maybe I'm not awakened. Maybe I'll go talk to those monks. And he talked to the monks, and they were like, yeah, bro, you are totally not awakened. You're suffering over this and that, and you're, all sorts of delusion in you, man. I was just saying that out of peace and love. You go further. Keep going, man. And Baha'ya lived far away from the Buddha, but he really wanted to go to the Buddha to get this lesson so he can get whatever these monks got. And so Baha'ya stayed up all night just wandering and wandering and wandering all night until the next day he found the Buddha. And when he found the Buddha was on alms rounds. And alms round is where the monks and nuns beg for food. They only eat what is freely given, so the Buddha was begging for food. And so Baha'ya was like, I found the teacher. I found the Buddha. This guy can teach me how to reach awakening. And so he runs up to the Buddha and he's like, Buddha, hey man, you got to teach me this stuff. And the Buddha's like, hey man, I'm on alms round, chill out. And Baha'ya's like, no way, I can die any second. I want to make sure I reach awakening before I die. And the Buddha's like, nah man, I got to eat, And Baha'ya asks for a 3rd time, please, Venerable Sir, please teach me your Dharma so I can end my suffering. And with the 3rd time being asked, the Buddha said, okay, we're out here. I'm not going to give you a long lesson, but I'm going to give you a lesson. This is your meditation. In the seen is just the seen. In the heard is just the heard. In the cognized is just the cognized. In the felt is just the felt. In the taste is just the taste, and so on. To just know the senses and know them as this bare knowledge, what they call the bare knowledge of the senses. And Bahá'í heard this and instantly started practicing it, started hearing the sounds directly, started seeing the sights directly, and just hearing, just seeing, just feeling. Boom. He reached awakening and then was instantly run over by an ox cart and died. Bahá'í was right. He could have died any second. So, at least he reached awakening before he died. His mission was served. But, how does this lead to awakening? What did Bahá'í go through? And this is where we may go into the deep end a little bit. And I don't want to get into a philosophy of this. I want to go into a practice, because we may get hit by an ox cart or what are those bar taverns on the way out of here or something like that, right? So let's take this with some spiritual urgency. What I want to talk about is where the senses lie on a list, of course the list, but one of the probably deepest lists of Buddhism, which is in dependent origination. The Buddha said if you understand dependent origination, you're awakened. You got this. You did it. So, I'm not awakened, but, I can use this in a practical sense, and so guide y'all through this. When we look at dependent origination, we just see the chain of causality of life and how we can create suffering for ourselves. And so traditionally, there's a couple different lists that rely on dependent origination. Traditionally, we look at the 12 links of dependent origination here. I'm not going to go through all 12 links. What I want to go through is where in this link of causality of the links of dependent origination, where these senses come to play. And so we have these 6 senses. Even notice them right now. Notice the sights, notice the sounds, notice the tastes, notice the felt sensations, even notice your thoughts right now. And as this machine goes online, this is where consciousness comes from. Have you ever sat and pondered consciousness? It's kind of a strange thing. That we have consciousness because we have senses. In Buddhism, we don't acknowledge that there's like an individual consciousness is separate from the senses. Like maybe a soul or a spirit. What we acknowledge is this machine goes online and we have seeing consciousness. As lights and figures and forms start hitting the eyes, boom, seeing consciousness goes online. And without seeing, without lights and forms, we wouldn't have seeing consciousness. So right now, you have a lot of consciousnesses hitting your eyes, right? Not just one consciousness, a bunch of consciousnesses. Same goes with the ears, like that sound over there, woo, 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 woo. The waveforms of the woo, woo, woos hit your ears. And as those waveforms hit your hearing consciousness goes online. Whoop, machine's online, right? And over again, what you'll notice is it's just arising and passing over and over and over again, but that's a list for another time. And so, as something like a sight hits your eyes, it's felt. And it's felt as either, and this is earlier in the practice of mindfulness, as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. We only have 3 feelings in Buddhism. Psychology, there's that whole wheel. We only have 3. Pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. So the sight is hitting the eye, it immediately. It's not you doing it. It's just automatically felt as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And this isn't a goal to have only pleasant sights and dismiss unpleasant sights. No, like it's okay. Notice when an unpleasant sight hits your eyes and notice what happens next. Or a pleasant sight hits your eyes. Notice what happens next. And so, seeing, sight hits, let's say it's unpleasant, hits the eyes. The next chain on this link, it would be craving. Craving kind of naturally occurs. When something is unpleasant, we crave for it to go away. And this is what we call aversion or hatred or dosa. Naturally, we don't like unpleasantness. We see a pleasant sight. Oh, we naturally crave that, cling that to that pleasantness. And neutral, we generally just ignore it, not excited by it. We get bored by it, right? And so, as the senses arise, felt as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, we have specific ways that we crave, whether that's through greed, hatred, or aversion. And then we have clinging. Clinging to these pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral sensations. And the way we find clinging is we tell ourselves a story about it. And so, as the sound hits the ears and I hear what my perception viewed as train, and that train was unpleasant, I'm trying to have a peaceful time in here, and that unpleasant sound arose, I have aversion. And I also have clinging. It's not supposed to be like this. This is supposed to be a peaceful place, and I can't have loud sounds in my peaceful meditation center. I can't get a fucking break from life anytime. I can't even go to the meditation center and get a break. And everywhere I go is fucking hot and blah, blah, blah. And now I'm in suffering land. Oh, come back. It's a sound. Come back to sound. Freedom. Boom. Back to sound. So every time you notice your mind bugging out into a story it's telling you about whatever it may be, come back to the sense where you get it from. And so whether that's a myriad of ones, we may see somebody, we may hear them say something, and we may feel something from that. Notice all of the ways that arises. This is a very practical tool for you to use, and a very practical tool that leads to very deep insight of the nature of reality and the nature of suffering and the freedom from suffering. So, what I want to go into is, another story, right? That while we want to know that this is how it works, sometimes we may actually try to put our own selfing around this. That we try really hard that I will be the one who cuts out that link of dependent origination of clinging and craving, and this becomes another object of our stress. And so I love that the Buddha talked about this human body is on fire, what we call the fire sermon. At a particular point, the Buddha was awake, and early, I think this is the second talk that he ever gave. Second talk the Buddha ever gave. He goes over to some fire worshipers. And these fire worshipers just had like long dreadlocks and, or kind of like hippies, And he goes over to them and starts talking. And they're spreading their dharma, he's spreading his dharma, and he learns that they worship fire. And he said, oh yeah, and then he starts talking about how the eyes are on fire, the ears are on fire, that the tongue is on fire, that the body's on fire, the mind's on fire. Have you noticed that? That these things are all on fire. And what are they on fire with? Greed, hatred, and ignorance. All those ways that we crave, that we try to run away from unpleasant experiences, that we cling to pleasant experiences, that we ignore neutral experiences. The body's on fire. And so, to extinguish this fire, I don't think that we really try to extinguish the fire. We let the flames kind of go out on their own. And for me, sometimes it's necessary to step into the fire. Because when my mind is on fire with activating thought processes that lead me to depression, I don't belong here. The world's a bunch of phonies, right? These old belief systems that I have. If I try to say, nah, man, you're wrong, that fire's just going to get bigger. If I find myself in a depression, a sense of shutdown, and I'm tired, I'm exhausted, if I try to rah-rah myself out of that depression, that weight of aversion is just going to get heavier and heavier, and that fire is just going to get bigger and bigger. And so I find the best way to extinguish the fire is to radically accept the fire. When I'm pissed off for no good reason, can I just step into that fire of being pissed off, right? Go, yeah, let this fire burn, let's go. And watch the fire ignite. And when I do that, it's like ass backwards. The fire starts going out, all on its own. Because what's truly the cause of our suffering is our over self-identifying with experience. That we take so much personal, and we can take our practice very personal. So if I find myself in a place of suffering, I create an identity around my suffering, and now my suffering becomes my responsibility to fix, manage, and control, which adds another layer of suffering. And so what helps us end this suffering is to let go. Let go. Let go not in a way to push it out. Let go is the first word, let. Let. As your suffering arises, let. And it will naturally go. And so whatever you're suffering over these days, let. First things first, let. And notice your relationship to it. Are you finding self in your suffering? Am I depression, my thought patterns? Am I saying this is mine? This is my problem to solve? And as soon as I do that, more suffering. But if I say, yeah, you're allowed to be here too, depression, that monster gets a little smaller. And so this is where we can bring in our mindfulness practice, and this is where I get into the instructions that we'll do a practice around. So if selfing, over self-identifying, and overly exerting ourselves is the cause of suffering, sometimes we get to meditation, and I teach something like mindfulness of breathing. And when your awareness wanders, come back to the breath. Over and over and over again. We can create a lot of stress and a lot of selfing around something like mindfulness of breathing. I got to be good at mindfulness of breathing. I got to be good and concentrated so I can feel good about myself. And when the mind wanders, I suck. Now I can feel bad about myself because the mind wandered, right? And it's like, damn, okay, we can turn anything into suffering, right? And so the cool thing about these sense spheres, the six senses, it's a lot looser in this practice. And it's a lot of permission in this practice that you don't have to be good. That this isn't another arena of self-judgment. This isn't another arena of something to be good at or bad at. And so I was on retreat at Dhammasukha, which was, he recently passed away, which was Bhante Vimalaramsi's center. And Bhante Vimalaramsi says mindfulness is observing the mind's attention and how it moves from object to object. Observing the mind's attention on how it moves from object to object. Quite different than what we typically think of mindfulness, at least in the popular world. Sometimes we think mindfulness is about strangle-holding the breath and only staying there, or strangle-holding whatever the chosen object is and only staying there. And that's when you're mindful. And when the mind wanders, you're not mindful anymore. When you're daydreaming, nope, that's not mindfulness. And what Vimalaramsi's saying here is, if you notice that you're daydreaming, that's actually mindfulness. And I agree with that. And so in this practice of resting in the senses, what we will do is, we'll bring some collected awareness. And I think that's extremely helpful to start maybe a couple minutes of mindfulness of breathing to bring our awareness inward. And then we start opening it up. And notice when the mind wanders, what is it wandering to? Is it wandering to a thought? If the mind wanders to a thought, know the cognized as the cognized, as the Buddha said. Know a thought as a thought. Go, thought, thought, thought. And if you need to label it with that word, thought, 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 that can be helpful. Thought, thought, thought. And then sit in the thought, observing the thought, not self-identifying with the thought. And then it wanders to a sound. Sound, sound, sound. Into the body. Your foot starts to hurt. Feeling, feeling, feeling. Body, body, body. Taste, taste, taste. Whatever it is, just note it. And that is mindfulness. And then you'll notice that there is a difference between falling asleep and waking up, though. When we start not knowing a thought as a thought, when these chains of dependent origination start occurring and you're not aware that they're occurring, that's the moment to wake up and know that that's occurring. Oh yeah, there is a belief in this. Belief, belief, belief. Unpleasant, unpleasant, unpleasant. Pleasant, pleasant, pleasant. Whatever it may be, note it. Note it, and that's what mindfulness is. And if you need a place to rest, like your home base, the breath is a good place. We use the breath because it's quite neutral. Generally, your breath, unless you're sick or something, doesn't feel any way. It doesn't feel pleasant, it doesn't feel unpleasant. It's quite neutral. So it's a neutral spot to rest. And then notice when it leaves. What does it leave to? And note it and come back. If you need specific instructions, note, hearing, smelling, tasting, seeing, even if your eyes are closed, seeing, feeling, thinking, the 6 sense bases. But, like I said, you don't have to get this right. Explore, discover, see for yourself, as the Buddha said, ehipassiko, see for yourself. Any questions before we dive into, maybe about 20 minutes of a mindfulness practice around the sense bases? I'll guide you through it. Mm-hmm. Stand if you need to stand. Stand if you need to stand. Yeah. Definitely. Oh, and if you could move to, we got a camera. Hi to everybody. No. All right. Yeah, so doing what you need to do, finding that supportive posture, that mindful posture. Notice how there's like communication in this body, heart, and mind, that a too rigid posture leads to a too rigid mind, but a too relaxed posture can lead to a too relaxed mind. So finding that balance of the upright spine with a soft body around the upright spine. And feeling your eyes closed, if that feels right for you. If not, just having a soft gaze on the floor in front of you is totally suitable. Loosening the grip on this body, softening any points of tension held. And setting this intention that there's nowhere to go, nothing to do. There's no right or wrong way to meditate. Just letting go into the experience that is present. And so as we shift into a little bit of mindfulness of breathing, just let the breath come to you. Not chasing it down, not grabbing on to the breath. Just notice the breath as it enters your awareness, as it comes to you. And begin to rest in this breath that showed itself. Notice how it shows up in the inhalation, how it shows up in the exhalation, comes back with the inhalation, leaves with the exhalation. Just become curious with this whole process of breathing, making friends with the breath, investigating the breath. And as the mind wanders, for now, just come back to the breath to build a little bit of collectedness. Just notice how the body is breathing itself. Nothing you need to do. It's all that doing that gets us into trouble in the first place. And so as we maintain this mindfulness of breathing, just as the body breathes all on its own, begin to notice how this body hears sound all on its own. Nothing you need to do to start hearing. Now, this consciousness comes online as sounds hit the ears. Begin to explore the textures of the sounds, the movements of sounds, passing of sound. And in the same way, even if your eyes are closed, noticing sight, lights on the backs of the eyelids, colors, shapes, and forms moving around. Just resting in the textures of sight, how they arise all on their own. And in the same way, taste, and smells. And the felt body, the sensations in the body. The tingling in the body. Any pressure in the body or lightness in the body. Any pleasure or pain in this body. That feeling consciousness arises. And so just like the body breathes on its own, the ears hear sound on their own, the eyes see all on their own. Notice how the mind thinks all on its own, shining the light of mindfulness directly onto the thoughts. That this thinking consciousness arises. And these are just electrical impulses blipping through the brain. Nothing to take personal. Knowing a thought is a thought. Feeling the thoughts, the arising and passing of thoughts. The sharpness or looseness of thoughts. Pleasantness or unpleasantness of thoughts. Just observing, thinking. And that's it. That's all we have. That's our base of reality. We only know what is felt in the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. There is nothing outside of these 6 bases. So this is the practice, sitting with the breath, and as the awareness wanders, note what it's wandered to. Thinking, 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 and then come back to the breath when it feels right. Hearing, tasting, feeling. Whatever it is, note what sense base is activated, and then come back to the breath. If any of these senses are on fire, see if you can make peace with the fire. Not trying to stifle the fire, not trying to fight the fire. As pain in the body arises, notice the links. We tell a story about it, make an action plan, and then just come back. Body, body, body. One thought leads to another thought and another thought, and we fall asleep. Just note thought, thought, thought.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noechel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.